In a business dispute or a legal dispute, it's obvious who the parties are. But in a community dispute, or what I call a public policy dispute, it's not obvious at all who needs to be at the table for progress to get made. So I want to talk a little bit more about what we can do to get the right parties to the table in a public disputes context. First thing is, when a city, for example, is trying to deal with a conflict, let's say at the neighborhood level, somebody wants to build something, some neighbors are for it, some are against it. They want to bring the right parties to the table. So if they reach an agreement, there's a way to move forward. They need to decide how much of the work of identifying the parties is the city's job and how much the city should contract for help with that to a professional neutral. Because in my view, the city is actually a party in many of these kinds of public disputes. So it would be better if they relied on a trusted neutral to go forward with the process I'm going to describe called Stakeholder Assessment. So the city might tap a neutral and say, we need to get the right parties to the table for this upcoming conversation aimed at resolving a neighborhood dispute. Go ahead, bring them to the table. And neutral says, well, who do you think the most important parties are? And the city says, well, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We deal with them all the time. They're on our case. We know they're important. Okay, that's the first circle of potential parties. And the neutral would go talk with them all privately on a confidential basis to understand their interests, their concerns, and then ask each of those parties, who else do you think might be a stakeholder in this case? And the neutral would then fan out, talk with a second circle of participants. City might even announce, we've got a process underway. Anyone who thinks they are a stakeholder in this case should contact this neutral. So there might be a third circle of people who identify themselves. So the neutral, rather than the city, is engaged in this process of exploring who the potential stakeholders are. Mm-hmm. And pretty much from the beginning, the goal is to fill out a kind of a matrix with categories of stakeholders down the side and issues across the top. And in each cell of that matrix, how important is each of these issues to that category of stakeholders? And what do they most want to have happen and not have happen with regard to each of those issues? And if a neutral can put that map or that matrix together and then send it to everyone that they interviewed and say, do you see what you told me? I didn't quote you. Do you see what you told me written down here? Did I get the categories of concern properly laid out? Did I rank order the issues of concern to each group? To me, that's the key to identifying the right parties.
And how do you know when you have everyone, that you haven't left anyone out?
Well, it's pretty hard to know for sure, because a category actually could have a lot or a few parties within it. So for example, if a dispute in a community involved something that somebody wanted to build and some neighbors were for it and some neighbors were against it, and I did 10 interviews with neighbors and 7 said we're in favor of it and 3 said we're against it, there's hundreds more neighbors. I have to wait and see whether I've got a proponent, opponent set of neighbor categories in my matrix, and whether I've stopped hearing anything more after my first 10 interviews than what I already have in those 2 categories. So the categories are represented by individuals, groups, organizations in a category, and I have to do enough interviews till I stop hearing new and different things. Then I feel I got the categories right.
Mm-hmm. It seems like even those could break down even further. You could have factions within factions.
Yeah, and that's going to be a big problem, because when I get categories identified, I have to figure out who's the most appropriate spokesperson for that category. And I would want them to figure that out. I want the caucus, the people or the groups in a category, and say, who do you want to nominate to speak for you in this particular conversation? And they have to be willing to take on that spokesperson role for that category, which includes staying in touch with the people that they ostensibly speak for or speak like. And all of this is work that's happening before we ever have a first meeting. So getting the right parties to the table means engaging a pretty large number of stakeholders in a conversation that would lead to a proposal to the city that says, these are the 10 categories of stakeholders. These are the groups that are most likely to speak for those categories of stakeholders effectively, and we think you ought to invite them. Now, there might still be factions that are not represented who might appear once the actual conversation starts, and the city's going to have to be open, and the parties are going to have to be open to augmenting the list of people at the table as the agenda shifts or changes or groups finally pay attention to what's going on and announce that they want to be involved.
It sounds like once you know these categories, then figuring out the representative person is difficult, and then making sure that they're accountable to the people that they represent. So how do you navigate that?
It's hard. I mean, in a legal dispute, lawyers represent parties, and there's all kinds of rules about representation. In a public disputes context, someone who's chosen as a proxy for a category that's not organized already into groups or official organizations, maybe will do a good job, maybe they won't do a good job. A lot falls on the facilitator of the actual dialogue that follows to provide good summaries of meetings and good information, and maybe make a website and say to people, look, we'll help you be in touch with the folks that you're supposed to speak for or speak like. And that could ensure that someone who might not otherwise be great at staying in touch with folks or even clarifying what the choices are for the people that they're supposed to be in touch with could have the help they need to do that. But all of this needs to be cobbled together. In each dispute handling situation or in each multi-party negotiation in a community, we don't have any kind of legally mandated techniques for how to do this. A lot of this hinges on skilled facilitation. So getting the right parties to the table means talking with a lot of people privately and confidentially, helping categories of groups choose spokespeople, supporting those spokespeople with the information and communications assistance they need to be in touch with people, and being open to adding even more people as the conversation proceeds. It's a lot trickier than just saying who are the parties to the business dispute or the legal dispute.